He brought his mistress to the biggest night of his career to make his ex-wife jealous. He just didn't know his ex-wife was the one who'd bought his company's debt, and she was already on the stage, waiting for him to walk in. Welcome back to Alcott Stories, the place where real emotions meet unforgettable stories. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we bring you powerful tales of love, betrayal, redemption, and second chances every single week. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, because tonight's story is one you won't forget. Here's a question I want you to sit with before we start. If someone hurt you badly enough to walk away with nothing, would you rather walk back into their life to save them, or build something so powerful they have no choice but to face what they lost? Tell me in the comments, would you have shown mercy like Elena, or would you have ended it completely? The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Lindgren Tower ballroom, and for exactly 3 seconds, Julian Cross thought it was an accident. It wasn't. Chloe had thrown it. Not at him, past him, close enough that the spray of champagne caught the cuff of his jacket, and she was already turning away before the glass finished breaking, her red-brown hair catching the chandelier light like she'd choreographed the whole exit. "You said this gala was about us," she hissed, loud enough for the nearest cluster of investors to hear, soft enough to sound like she hadn't meant them to. 3 hours, Julian, 3 hours, and you haven't introduced me to a single person who matters." Julian's jaw tightened. 200 of the most powerful people in American finance were in this room, and his date had just made a scene over canopies and attention.
"Lower your voice," he said.
"Or what?" Chloe's eyes glittered, not with hurt, with calculation. "You'll replace me? With who? You burned that bridge 2 years ago, remember?" He remembered. He remembered it every day in the particular silence of a penthouse built for 2 people and occupied by one. A waiter swept in to handle the broken glass. The string quartet kept playing. Nobody in this industry let a little blood in the water stop the party. They just watched, recalculating the way predators recalculate. Julian didn't have time to recalculate because he was still running the numbers on tonight. Cross Capital had spent 11 months negotiating the acquisition of Halcyon Fintech, a deal that would quadruple his firm's assets under management and silence every analyst who'd quietly started using the word overextended in their reports. His father had built Cross Capital from a single floor in a midtown building 40 years ago. Julian had spent the last 6 years trying to prove he hadn't just inherited it, he'd grown it. Tonight was supposed to be the proof. He'd brought Chloe because optics mattered, and a confident, beautiful woman on his arm read as stability to the kind of men who decided whether to trust him with their capital. That was the whole calculation. He hadn't expected to feel this hollow doing it. "I need air," Chloe announced, and stalked toward the terrace doors, leaving a trail of perfume and unspoken accusations behind her. Julian let her go. He'd learned over 8 months of whatever this relationship was that Chloe's exits were rarely about air. They were about being followed. He didn't follow. Instead, he turned back toward the ballroom floor, toward the small crowd of board members and bankers circling like they always did before a major announcement, performing patience while their eyes did the real work, cataloging who stood near whom, who'd been seen leaving early, whose stock had quietly dipped that week. Julian had grown up in rooms like this. He knew how to wear the mask. He smiled at a senator's chief of staff. He shook hands with a man who managed a sovereign wealth fund. He said all the right things in all the right cadences, and underneath all of it, a small, persistent voice kept asking him a question he didn't have an answer for. Why does all of this still feel like nothing? He told himself it was exhaustion. 11 months of deal-making did that to a person. He told himself it had nothing to do with the fact that somewhere in the last 2 years, success had stopped tasting like anything at all. At 9:52, the lights along the east wall began to dim. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The reason he'd cleared his calendar for an entire evening, rented out the top 3 floors of the Lindgren, flown in caterers from a Michelin-starred kitchen in Chicago. Tonight, Cross Capital was finalizing the Halcyon acquisition publicly in front of the only audience that mattered, the people who decided, in rooms just like this one, whether a man was somebody or nobody. The massive double doors at the front of the ballroom, the ones that had stayed shut all evening, guarded by two men in unmarked suits who wouldn't say who they worked for, began to open. A voice came over the sound system, smooth and rehearsed, the voice of a professional MC who did this for a living and felt nothing about any of it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and CEO of Solace Holdings, the firm behind tonight's acquisition, and the new majority stakeholder in Cross Capital's debt portfolio. Julian frowned. That wasn't the deal he'd signed off on. Halcyon was an acquisition, an asset Cross Capital was buying, not a liability someone else now held leverage over. His CFO, Marcus Webb, had assured him 3 weeks ago that Solace Holdings was a silent financing partner, a boutique firm that preferred to operate without a public face, the kind of institutional money that just wired funds and stayed quiet. Marcus had used the word invisible. Julian remembered that specifically because he remembered thinking it was a strange word for a business partner. He scanned the room for Marcus, found him near the bar, already pale, already not making eye contact with anyone, which told Julian everything he needed to know about whether Marcus had seen this coming. He hadn't asked for clarification. There hadn't been time. Because the doors had opened fully, and a woman stepped out alone onto the small stage that had been built at the front of the ballroom, Julian's stomach dropped before his mind caught up to what his body already knew. She wore emerald, not the loud, attention-grabbing green that designers push on women trying to be noticed, but a deep, deliberate shade that made the rest of the room look slightly washed out by comparison. Her dark hair was swept back from her face in a way that left nothing to hide behind. Her shoulders were set the way they never used to be when she stood next to him, squared, unapologetic, like she'd spent 2 years practicing how to take up exactly as much space as she deserved. Elena, the Elena who had walked out of his penthouse 2 years ago with 2 suitcases and 0 alimony because she'd refused to take a single dollar from a man who had cheated on her in their own bed, in their own home, while she was at a hospital fundraiser raising money for a children's ward she'd spent 8 months organizing. The Elena who used to apologize for taking up space in rooms exactly like this one, who used to stand half a step behind him at events like tonight's, who used to laugh a little too quickly at things rich men said, because she'd grown up believing that women like her, the daughter of a nurse and a man who fixed air conditioners, had to earn their place in rooms full of money. She didn't apologize now. She crossed the stage like she owned the floor beneath her feet, and as it turned out, in the most literal sense possible, she did. "Good evening," Elena said into the microphone, and her voice was calm in a way that made the calm feel dangerous. "Most of you know me as a name on paperwork you signed without reading the fine print. Let me fix that. My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm the founder of Solace Holdings, and as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, my firm holds 61% of Cross Capital's outstanding debt obligations." A murmur went through the crowd, sharp, electric, the sound of 200 people doing math at once. Someone near the bar laughed once, a short, disbelieving bark, and then went quiet. Julian heard none of the room's reaction. He was staring at the woman who used to make him coffee at 6 in the morning before either of them could afford a coffee machine, the woman he'd once told, to her face, in the bedroom of the brownstone they'd rented before any of this money existed, that she'd never be enough for a life like the one he was building. He remembered saying it. He remembered the specific cruelty of choosing those exact words, because some small, ugly part of him at the time had wanted to see what they'd do to her. She was standing in the center of his empire now, holding the only copy of the key. Chloe's hand found his arm, nails digging in slightly through the fabric of his sleeve. She'd come back from the terrace at some point during the last 90 seconds, drawn by the same gravitational pull that had drawn everyone else's attention to the stage. "Julian," she whispered, and for the first time all night, the calculation in her voice had curdled into something closer to fear. "Who is that?" Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. He was doing the only math that mattered to him right now. Not the percentages, not the debt structure, but a simpler equation. The woman he'd discarded like she was disposable now held his entire company in the palm of her hand, and she had walked into this room knowing exactly what she was about to do to him. Elena's eyes found his across the ballroom. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. "There's a lot to discuss tonight," she said into the microphone, still looking at him, though nothing in her expression gave away that she was looking at anyone in particular. Some of it business, some of it personal. I find those two things have a habit of becoming the same conversation. A man Julian didn't recognize, silver-haired, sharp-suited, holding a tablet like it was a weapon, stepped onto the stage beside her and murmured something. Elena nodded once, then continued. Cross Capital's board will receive a formal restructuring proposal from Solace Holdings within 72 hours, she said, and now her voice had shifted fully into business, crisp, unhurried, the voice of someone reading numbers off a page she'd memorized weeks ago. I want to be clear about something, because I know how rumors travel in rooms like this. This is not a hostile takeover. I have no interest in dismantling what Cross Capital has built. I have a very specific interest in how it's been run. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Somewhere behind Julian, a man, he thought it might be one of the Halcyon board members, said quietly, "Jesus, she bought the rope before we even signed." Julian felt something hot climb up the back of his neck. 2 years. 2 years of building Cross Capital back from the quiet humiliation of his divorce. 2 years of telling reporters that his personal life had no bearing on his professional judgment. 2 years of believing, actually believing, that Elena had crawled off somewhere small and licked her wounds while he kept climbing. She hadn't been licking wounds. She'd been building. "I'd like to thank everyone for their patience this evening," Elena said, stepping back from the microphone slightly, signaling the end of her remarks with the same economy of movement she brought to everything else. "Enjoy the rest of the gala. I imagine some of you have calls to make." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. The kind of laughter people produce when they're not sure if they're allowed to find something funny, when the joke might be on them specifically. Elena turned and walked off the stage, the silver-haired man falling into step beside her, already talking in low tones about something on his tablet. She didn't look back at Julian. She didn't need to do that either. She'd made her point with a single look, and now she was simply moving on to the next item on whatever list governed her evening, as if Julian Cross and the wreckage she'd just detonated in the center of his life were a line she'd already checked off. "Julian," Chloe's voice again, sharper now, the fear giving way to something more practical, the recalculation of a woman who had built her entire approach to him around the assumption that he was, and would remain, the most powerful person in any room he entered. "What does this mean? What does she want?" "I don't know," Julian said, and it was the first completely honest sentence he'd spoken all night. Across the ballroom, Marcus Webb was finally looking at him, pale, sweating slightly under the chandeliers, mouthing something that might have been, "I'm sorry," or might have been, "I didn't know," and Julian genuinely couldn't tell which, and right now he genuinely didn't care. He found himself moving toward the side exit where Elena had disappeared, ignoring Chloe's voice calling his name behind him, ignoring the handshakes offered by men he should have stopped for, ignoring everything except the singular, consuming need to understand how the woman he'd once told wasn't enough had just become the only person in the world who could end him with a signature. He didn't reach the door before his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. A text, no name attached, just a number he didn't recognize. "Conference room B, 10 minutes. Come alone." For your own sake, Julian stared at the message, his heart doing something complicated and fast in his chest. He looked up toward the corridor where Elena had gone, then back down at the phone. 10 minutes. He had 10 minutes to decide whether to walk into a room with a woman who'd spent 2 years quietly building the exact weapon she'd just used to bring his entire empire to its knees, and whether he had the nerve to ask her why. Behind him, the string quartet started a new piece. Nobody in the ballroom had any idea that the real performance of the evening hadn't started yet. Conference room B sat at the end of a marble corridor on the Lindgren's 42nd floor, far enough from the ballroom that the music became a distant pulse instead of a soundtrack. Julian had walked this corridor 100 times. He'd hosted 3 other events in this building, but tonight it felt unfamiliar, like the walls had rearranged themselves while he wasn't looking. He knocked once. The door opened before his knuckles finished the second knock. Elena stood in the doorway, the emerald dress catching the recessed lighting of the room behind her. Up close, the 2 years showed, not in lines on her face, but in the way she held herself, the particular stillness of someone who'd learned not to flinch. "You came alone," she said. "Not a question, an observation, filed away. You told me to. I told a lot of people a lot of things tonight." She stepped back, allowing him into the room. Most of them didn't listen either. The conference room held a long glass table, a wall of windows overlooking the city, and the silver-haired man from the stage who was seated at a laptop, not looking up. Julian recognized him now, David Okafor, a forensic accountant whose name occasionally surfaced in financial press coverage of corporate disputes, always attached to the word devastating. "David's going to need about 20 minutes, Elena said, closing the door behind Julian. "So we have time." "Time for what?" "For you to ask the question you've been chewing on since I walked off that stage." She moved to the window, putting the city between them, a habit Julian remembered from when they were married. Elena had always preferred talking to a reflection over talking face to face when the conversation mattered. "Go ahead." Julian's hands found the back of a chair, gripping it harder than he meant to. "How long have you been planning this?" "Wrong question." Elena's reflection in the glass watched him without turning around. "But I'll answer it anyway. 18 months. I formed Solace 14 months ago. It took 4 months before that to find the right people to help me do it properly. 18 months. Julian's mind reeled backward, recalculating 2 years of his life against a timeline he hadn't known existed. "You left with nothing. You wouldn't take $1 of alimony. I offered. You offered me money to make yourself feel less guilty," Elena said, finally turning. "I didn't want to feel like I owed you anything, not even gratitude. So instead you went and built a company that could buy mine out from under me. I built a company," she said evenly, "'cause I was good at something, and for 6 years I let you convince me that my job was being good at you. I ran the back office of 3 different funds before I married you, Julian. I understood debt structuring before I understood how to make you the eggs you liked. I just never got to use it because being your wife was supposedly a full-time job that didn't leave room for anything else." Julian had no response to that. It was true, and hearing it stated as fact without venom was somehow worse than if she'd screamed it. "Why Cross Capital specifically?" he asked instead. "There are 100 firms you could have built Solace around. Why mine?" Something flickered across Elena's face, the first crack in the composure she'd worn since the stage. "Because 3 months after our divorce, I found out you'd quietly pushed out 2 senior people who'd supported me during the split. Both women, both with more tenure than the men who replaced them. You didn't fire me, Julian. You couldn't legally. I was never your employee. So you fired the people who reminded you that I existed and had allies." Julian felt the air leave his chest. He remembered the reorganization. He remembered telling himself it was about performance metrics. "That's not," he started. "Don't," Elena said, not unkindly, but with finality. "I have the personnel files. I have the timeline. I have the emails between you and Marcus Webb where you used the phrase optics problem to describe 2 women who'd worked for your company for 9 years combined. I'm not telling you this to relitigate it. I'm telling you because you asked why, and that's why." The door opened. David Okafor finally looked up from his laptop, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who had learned to deliver bad news as a profession. "Elena, you'll want to see this." She crossed to the laptop. Julian followed, uninvited but unstopped. On the screen was a spreadsheet, wire transfers, dates, account numbers partially redacted. Julian's eyes scanned it without immediately understanding what he was looking at. "Whose account is this?" he asked. "Yours," David said. "Or rather, the personal holding account Cross Capital set up for executive discretionary spending, the one your CFO has access to alongside you." Julian's stomach turned cold. "I know the account. What am I looking at? 11 transfers over the last 7 months, David said, scrolling, totaling just under $2.3 million, routed through 3 intermediary accounts before landing in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. "That account requires 2 signatures, Julian said slowly. "Mine and Marcus's. It requires a second signature," Elena corrected. "Marcus has delegation authority. He's not the only one who can countersign." Julian's mind moved through the list of people with delegated signing authority on that account, a short list, because Cross Capital kept that circle deliberately small. Marcus. 2 board members, and Chloe, who he'd added 8 months ago against his lawyer's advice because she'd asked sweetly and he'd wanted for once to give a woman in his life something without negotiating for it first. Chloe, he said, the name leaving his mouth like something bitter. I can't confirm anything until forensics finishes the trace, David said, but the pattern is consistent. Small, irregular withdrawals, none individually large enough to trigger a compliance flag, all moved into an account that was opened 9 months ago, 1 month before she was added to your signing authority. Julian sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the chair he'd been gripping minutes earlier, now the only thing holding him up. 8 months of late nights, of expensive dinners, of Chloe's hand on his arm at exactly the right moments in exactly the right rooms, and somewhere underneath all of it she'd been quietly bleeding him dry through a door he'd opened for her himself. "Why would you show me this?" Julian asked, looking up at Elena. "You just took my company. You have no reason to warn me about anything." Elena's expression didn't soften, but something in her posture shifted, a kind of weariness Julian hadn't seen on her before, not even during the divorce. "Because I'm not interested in destroying you through someone else's crime, Julian. If I'm going to take this company apart and rebuild it, I want it done because of what you did. Not because your girlfriend happened to be a thief I found first." "That's not mercy," Julian said. "That's precision. Maybe it's both." Elena closed David's laptop gently, the gesture oddly tender given the conversation surrounding it. "David, can you give us a minute?" David nodded, gathering his things and stepping into the hallway without comment, the door clicking shut behind him with the particular discretion of someone paid extremely well to be discreet. Alone again, the silence between them filled with 2 years of unspoken things, all of them suddenly relevant again. "I need to ask you something," Julian said. "And I need you to actually answer it, not the corporate version, the real one." Elena crossed her arms, waiting. "Did you do all of this?" Julian said. "Because of the company, or because of me?" For a long moment, Elena said nothing. Outside, the city hummed 30 floors below them, indifferent to the question hanging in the room. "Does it matter?" she finally said. "Either way, the outcome's the same. Either way, you're sitting in that chair, and I'm the one who decides what happens next. It matters to me. Why? Because if you did this for the company, then I lost a competitor I never saw coming, and that's just business." His voice cracked slightly, the first unguarded sound he'd made all night. "But if you did this because of me, because of what I did to you, then I need to know if there's anything left to fix. Or if I burned it all the way down 2 years ago and I've just been too arrogant to notice." Elena studied him for a long moment, and Julian had the unsettling sense that she was deciding, in real time, how much truth he could survive hearing. "I started Solace because of the company," she said finally. "The mistreatment, the culture, the way you ran things, that was real, and it mattered, and it was reason enough on its own. But you're right that it's not the whole truth." Her voice dropped, quieter now, more dangerous for its softness. "The whole truth is that for the first year after I left, I couldn't stop replaying the moment I found out about her. Not the affair itself, the way you looked at me when I confronted you. Like I was an inconvenience, like 6 years of my life amounted to a scheduling conflict you were annoyed about." She exhaled slowly. "I built Solace because building something powerful was the only way I knew how to stop feeling like the woman in that memory. It was never about getting you back, Julian. It was about making sure I never had to be her again." The honesty of it landed harder than any accusation could have. Julian sat with it, the weight of 2 years finally settling into something he could no longer outrun with charm or money, or the practiced confidence that had carried him through every other crisis in his life. "I'm not going to pretend I have a right to ask this," he said quietly. "But is there any version of tonight where this ends with us talking like people who used to love each other, instead of 2 executives across a negotiating table?" Something in Elena's face tightened, not quite anger, something closer to old grief resurfacing. "Julian, in about 4 hours, the financial press is going to publish a story about embezzlement at Cross Capital, traced to a woman you brought to this gala as your date. In about 72 hours, my firm is going to present your board with a restructuring proposal that will require you to answer for 6 years of decisions you made believing no one would ever check your work." She stepped closer, and for a moment, Julian hoped, that she might reach for him. She didn't. I'm not your enemy tonight, but I'm not your soft place to land either. That woman doesn't exist anymore. You made sure of that a long time before I did. A knock sounded at the door, sharp, urgent. David's voice came through, tight with something that hadn't been there before. Elena, you need to see this. It's the financial blog. Market Pulse. Someone leaked documents 20 minutes ago. It's not us. Elena's composure flickered for the first time all night. Leaked what? The door opened. David stood there holding his tablet, his expression no longer neutral. Forged loan documents, implicating you in a hostile takeover scheme against Cross Capital, backdated to make it look premeditated and illegal. Someone wants the story to be that you're the villain in this, not him. Julian and Elena looked at each other, the same question forming in both their minds at the same moment, though only one of them said it out loud. Chloe, Julian said. Elena was already moving toward the door, the brief, fragile honesty between them swallowed instantly by the urgency of the next crisis. Get David's team on tracing the leak, she said, not to Julian, to herself, already 3 steps ahead. And somebody find your girlfriend before she disappears with whatever's left in that Cayman account. Julian followed her into the corridor, the ballroom music growing louder as they approached, both of them aware that whatever fragile truth had passed between them in that conference room now had to wait, because somewhere in this building, a woman who'd spent the night being humiliated in front of 200 people had just decided that if she was going down, she wasn't going down alone. The ballroom had changed shape in the 20 minutes Julian had been gone. He could feel it the moment he stepped back through the doors, the way a room feels different when its occupants have started forming theories about each other. Conversations clustered tighter. Phones were out, screens tilted away from view, the particular body language of people reading something they weren't supposed to enjoy reading quite as much as they did. Elena moved through the crowd ahead of him, untouched by the whispers, or at least appearing that way. Julian had forgotten this about her, how she could walk through a hostile room like the hostility belonged to someone else. There, she nodded toward the terrace doors. Chloe stood near the railing, phone pressed to her ear, free hand gesturing sharply even though whoever she was talking to couldn't see her. She hadn't noticed them yet. Julian used the 30 feet of distance to study her the way he should have studied her 8 months ago. Really studied her, instead of just enjoying being looked at by her. Don't care what the lawyer says, I need it moved tonight, Chloe was saying, voice low and clipped. If this blows up, I'm not sitting here waiting for. She turned and saw them. The phone came down from her ear slowly, her expression rearranging itself in real time from panic to something more practiced. Wounded innocence, the same expression she'd used on Julian 100 times when he'd questioned a credit card statement. Julian. Her voice climbed half an octave, brightened. Thank God. There's something happening, some article. People are saying things about your company, about her. A sharp glance at Elena, and I didn't know what to do, so I called my lawyer, because honestly I'm scared for you and stop. Julian said it quietly, but something in his tone made her actually stop. What? The account, Julian said. The discretionary spending account. 11 transfers. $2.3 million to a Cayman account opened 9 months ago, 1 month before I gave you signing authority. For exactly 1 second, Chloe's face went perfectly still, the particular stillness of someone recalculating very fast. Then it dissolved into wounded confusion, expertly deployed. I don't. What are you even talking about, Julian? Is this her? Is she telling you I did something? David's forensics team traced it before either of us said a word, Elena said evenly. I'd be careful about which lies you commit to right now, because we'll be able to disprove most of them by morning. Chloe's eyes flicked between them. Julian, then Elena, then back to Julian, searching his face for the version of him that still wanted to believe her. She found something there, some flicker of doubt, and pressed into it. Babe. The word landed strange in the cold air of the terrace, too intimate for the moment. You know me. You know I wouldn't do that to you. This is exactly what she wants, to make you distrust everyone around you so you have no one left but her. I haven't said a word about wanting him back, Elena said. You don't have to say it. Chloe snapped, the mask slipping for the first time, something genuinely ugly surfacing underneath. You think I don't see what this is? You spend 2 years building some empire just so you can walk in here and humiliate him in front of everyone he answers to? That's not business, sweetheart. That's revenge wearing a blazer. Maybe, Elena said, unbothered. But revenge doesn't usually come with a forensic audit trail. Yours does. I want to see the documents, Julian said. Now, whatever Market Pulse posted, whatever you've supposedly seen, show me. Chloe's composure cracked further, the brightness in her voice curdling into something defensive and fast. I don't have to show you anything. You're choosing to believe a woman who hates you over the woman who's actually been here for the last 8 months. Do you understand how that sounds? I understand exactly how it sounds, Julian said. I've spent 6 years married to manipulation, Chloe. I recognize the choreography. Something shifted in her eyes, calculation giving way finally to genuine fear. She glanced toward the ballroom doors, toward the exits, the way people glance when they're measuring distance instead of listening to conversation. You're going to regret this, she said, low and fast. Both of you. You think I don't know things? I know about the Halcyon deal you buried in due diligence, Julian. I know about the environmental violations your lawyers paid to keep quiet 3 years ago. You think I spent 8 months in your life and didn't pay attention? Julian felt the floor of his confidence shift slightly. He hadn't expected her to know about Halcyon's buried liabilities, a detail he'd kept compartmentalized even from his own board, the kind of thing that could trigger a much larger investigation than the one currently unfolding. Elena, however, didn't flinch. We already know about the Halcyon liabilities, she said. It's page 14 of the restructuring proposal your board receives in 72 hours. You're not holding a card we don't already have, Chloe. You're just telling us you've been planning your exit for a while. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened all night. I want a lawyer, Chloe said finally, the brightness gone entirely now, replaced by something flat and cornered. That's the first reasonable thing you've said tonight, Elena replied. David appeared at the terrace doors, tablet in hand, his expression grim in a way that made Julian's stomach drop a second time. Elena, the leak, we traced the originating IP. It came from a device registered to this venue's guest Wi-Fi logged in 40 minutes ago. He glanced at Chloe, then back to Elena. Same window, she was on the terrace alone. That's not proof of anything, Chloe said quickly. Anyone could have used that network. True, David said. Except the forged documents reference internal Solace formatting templates that aren't public. Only someone with access to materials I personally distributed within the last 6 hours could have replicated them that precisely. He paused. I distributed those materials to exactly 4 people tonight. Elena, myself, our counsel, and Marcus Webb shared his tablet password with his assistant earlier this evening because he forgot his own login. Julian's head turned sharply. Marcus's assistant is dating someone on Chloe's friend list. I've seen them at 2 of her events. The pieces assembled themselves with the particular speed of a story finally finding its real shape. Chloe hadn't acted alone. She'd used a chain of small, deniable favors, the same kind of soft manipulation she'd used on Julian for 8 months, except this time aimed at unraveling Elena's credibility before the financial markets could fully process what Elena had revealed on that stage. This is insane, Chloe said, but her voice had lost its conviction, the performance finally collapsing under its own weight. You're building a conspiracy out of coincidences. Maybe, Elena said. Or maybe you've spent 8 months learning exactly how Cross Capital's internal systems work. The same way you spent the last 9 months learning how to move money without tripping a compliance flag. Either way, by morning it won't matter what you call it. It'll be in a filing. Chloe looked at Julian one more time. Searching, Julian realized, for the man who used to choose her comfort over inconvenient truths, the man who'd given her signing authority because she'd asked sweetly and he'd wanted, for once, to give a woman in his life something without negotiating for it first. That man would have pulled her aside right now, would have found a way to believe her, would have let his ego decide what was true. Julian found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't recognize that man anymore, or didn't want to. Security will walk you out, he said quietly. Don't go near the financial systems again. David's team has already locked your access. You're choosing her, Chloe said, disbelief flooding her voice. After everything, you're actually choosing her. I'm not choosing anyone, Julian said. I'm choosing not to be the man who looks at a forensic audit trail and decides to believe the prettier lie instead. I did that once already. It cost me the only good thing I ever had. For the briefest second, something almost like respect flickered across Elena's face. Gone before Julian could be sure he hadn't imagined it. 2 security guards arrived, summoned by a call Julian hadn't seen David make. Chloe's composure finally gave out entirely as they approached, the wounded, innocent mask dropping into something raw and furious. "This isn't over," she said, the words aimed at both of them now, no longer bothering to choose a side. "Either of you." "It is for you," Elena said simply, and turned away before the guards had even reached her. Already moving back toward the ballroom, already 3 steps ahead of the next crisis the way she'd been all night, Julian watched Chloe being escorted through the terrace doors, her heels loud and uneven against the stone, and felt nothing where he expected to feel something. No grief, no vindication, just a kind of quiet exhaustion, the specific tiredness of a man finally putting down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He turned to find Elena watching him from a few feet away, the city lights behind her, the ballroom music a muffled pulse through the glass doors. "You didn't have to help me get her out," Julian said. "I didn't do it for you," Elena said. "I did it because Solace's reputation can't survive a fraud allegation in the press, however baseless, without a clean resolution attached to it by morning. Removing her quickly protects my firm. That it also happens to help you is incidental." "Incidental," Julian repeated, almost smiling despite everything. "You used to be a worse liar." Something flickered at the corner of Elena's mouth, not quite a smile but its distant cousin. "I had a good teacher." David cleared his throat from the doorway, tablet still in hand. "Elena, the board chair is calling. He wants to know if Solace is prepared to make a statement before the markets open in Asia. We have maybe 4 hours." Elena's expression sobered instantly, the brief warmth between them packed away as efficiently as it had appeared. "Tell him I'll call in 10 minutes. She looked back at Julian, and for a moment something passed between them that felt almost like the ghost of an old understanding. 2 people who used to make decisions together, briefly remembering what that had felt like. "This isn't finished," she said. "Not the company. Not us. There's a version of tomorrow where Cross Capital survives this, Julian, but it doesn't look anything like the company you've been running. And there's a version where it doesn't survive at all. Which one happens depends on what you say to me in the next hour." "Then ask me," Julian said. "Whatever it is, ask me now." Elena studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that used to precede her biggest decisions back when they were married, the careful, unhurried calculation of someone who'd learned the hard way that impulsive choices around Julian Cross always cost her something. "Not here," she said finally. "Conference room B, 15 minutes. And Julian, she paused at the terrace doors, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. "Whatever you're about to ask me for in that room, make sure it's the truth you want, not the one that's easiest to live with. I won't have patience for the difference tonight." She disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving Julian alone on the terrace with the city spread out below him, suddenly aware that the gala he'd built to cement his place at the top of his industry had instead become the night his entire life finally came due. Conference room B looked different the second time Julian entered it. The first time it had felt like a courtroom. Now it felt like the last room left standing in the world. Elena was already there, near the window again, but this time she wasn't watching his reflection. She was watching the city itself, like she was trying to memorize it before something in her own life changed for good. "You're early," she said without turning. "I didn't want to spend 15 minutes pretending to talk to people I don't care about. That's new." She finally turned to face him. "You used to love that part. The performing. I used to love a lot of things that turned out to be performances." Julian sat down, not because he wanted to, but because his legs had finally stopped pretending they weren't shaking. "Ask me your question." Elena crossed her arms, studying him with the same careful, unhurried calculation she'd shown on the terrace. "What do you think happens to Cross Capital tomorrow?" "I think the board panics. I think 2 members resign by Wednesday. I think the stock drops at the open and the Halcyon deal either collapses or gets renegotiated at half the valuation. And I think every reporter who's ever wanted a reason to write about me finally gets one. That's what happens to the company," Elena said. I asked what you think should happen. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere below, a siren wailed and faded, swallowed by the city. I think I should lose the chair, he said finally. Not because you're forcing me to. Because I haven't deserved it in a long time, and somewhere in the last 6 years I started mistaking fear for respect and obedience for loyalty, and I built a company that ran on both instead of either. Something shifted behind Elena's eyes, not quite surprise, but close to it. That's further than I expected you to get on your own. I had 2 long years to think about how I got here. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm not asking you to give me anything back, Elena. I know that's not on the table, and honestly, I don't think I'd trust myself if you offered. I'm asking what you actually want, not the restructuring proposal. You. What do you want to happen to me? Elena exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding the breath since the gala began. I want you to step down as CEO, effective before the board meets Wednesday, voluntarily, so it reads as accountability instead of a coup. I want full cooperation with the forensic audit, including the halcyon liabilities you buried. Every employee affected by what gets uncovered gets made whole before a single dollar reaches shareholders. And I want the 2 women you forced out after our divorce reinstated, with back pay if they're willing to come back. If they're not, I want them compensated as if they'd never left. And if I refuse, then Solace calls in the debt tomorrow morning. The company can't cover it, and you spend 3 years in litigation watching everything your father built get sold off in pieces to pay creditors. You'll still lose the chair. You'll just lose it ugly in public with your name attached to a bankruptcy instead of a resignation. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. I'm offering you the version where you walk away looking like a man who finally did one decent thing. That's not mercy, Julian. That's just better math. Julian almost laughed, a short, exhausted sound with no real humor in it. You really did become better at this than me. I had to. You taught me the only safety in rooms like this is being the smartest person in them. She uncrossed her arms, something in her posture softening, just slightly. I'm not enjoying this, if that's what you think. I didn't build Solace because I wanted to watch you fall apart in a conference room. I built it because I refused to spend the rest of my life being the woman who got left behind. This is just where that road happened to lead. Did it lead anywhere good? Julian asked quietly. For you, I mean, not the company, you. Elena considered the question longer than she'd considered anything else that night. I don't know yet, she admitted. I know I don't lie awake feeling small anymore. I know I built something with my own hands that no one can take credit for but me. Whether that's the same thing as good, I'm still finding out. Julian nodded slowly, something settling in his chest that felt almost like peace, or at least its early outline. For what it's worth, and I know it isn't worth much, coming from me, tonight, I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry I said during the divorce, when I was really just sorry I'd gotten caught. The real kind. I'm sorry for what I said to you in that bedroom. I'm sorry for the women I pushed out because they reminded me you used to exist in spaces I wanted to forget you'd touched. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see any of it clearly. Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her face suggested she believed him. Not enough to undo 2 years, but enough to let the apology land somewhere real instead of bouncing off. Step down Wednesday, she said. Cooperate with the audit. Make it right for the people you hurt. That's not me forgiving you, Julian. That's just me telling you what accountability looks like since you asked. He nodded. I'll do it. David knocked once and entered without waiting, tablet in hand, his expression considerably lighter than an hour earlier. Chloe's lawyer just called ours. She's agreed to a settlement instead of fighting the fraud charges, full restitution, cooperation with the embezzlement investigation in exchange for no criminal referral. Given what we have, I'd take it. Take it, Elena said. David nodded and left, already dialing before he reached the hallway. Julian stood, feeling the strange lightness of a man who'd just lost almost everything and somehow felt more solid than he had in years. What happens to us now? Not the company. Us. Elena's expression held something gentler than business, though not quite warmth. I don't know if there's an us, Julian. Not the way you mean it, but I don't think there has to be an enemy either. Maybe that's enough for now. It wasn't the answer he'd hoped for. It was, he realized, more than he deserved. 3 months later, Cross Capital's new CEO stood at the front of a much smaller, much quieter room, a town hall for employees, not a gala for investors. Elena Vasquez wore navy instead of emerald, her hair down instead of swept back, and the room watched her with something closer to hope than the ballroom had ever managed. "We're not going to pretend the last 6 years didn't happen," she told the room. "We're going to do better than that. We're going to fix what we can and be honest about what we can't and build something here that doesn't require anyone to stay small to survive it." The restructuring had gone almost exactly as she'd predicted, give or take a few details Julian hadn't seen coming. The board had accepted the voluntary resignation with visible relief, the kind of relief men only show when a problem disappears without forcing them to take a public stand on it. The halcyon liabilities had come out in a controlled disclosure, painful but survivable, the stock dropping 11% in a single morning before stabilizing within the week. Once analysts realized the company was finally being honest about its own numbers instead of managing them. Marcus Webb had resigned the same week, quietly, before the audit could formally implicate him in anything more serious than willful blindness, which, David had said dryly, was its own kind of guilt. Of the 2 women Julian had pushed out after the divorce, one had returned, with back pay and a promotion she should have been given 2 years earlier. The other had declined, having built something better for herself in the meantime, and Elena had made sure her settlement reflected exactly what she was owed, instead of what the company could get away with offering. In the back of the town hall, sitting in a folding chair instead of a boardroom seat, Julian Cross listened to a consultant explain culture reform initiatives, a title and a role he'd accepted with more humility than he'd ever managed to show as CEO. It wasn't redemption, not yet, not in any way that felt complete. It was closer to penance with a job description attached, the kind of work that asked him to spend his days fixing exactly the kind of damage he used to cause without noticing. He caught Elena's eye once across the room, somewhere in the middle of her remarks. She nodded, briefly, the way colleagues nod at each other across a shared project. Nothing more, nothing less. He was learning, enough to build a day around, if not yet a life. Chloe Bennett, last anyone heard, had moved back to Ohio. Her settlement covered restitution and little else. No severance, no soft landing, nothing resembling the lifestyle she'd spent 8 months carefully assembling around someone else's money. The numbered account in the Cayman Islands had been seized in full as part of the agreement. Whatever future she was building now, she was building it from nothing, the way Elena once had, except without the 18 months of careful planning and without anyone waiting to forgive her for it. Elena Vasquez didn't find her second chance in a man. She found it in a company that finally matched the woman who'd quietly been capable of running it all along, sharper than anyone had given her credit for, steadier under pressure than the man she'd once stood half a step behind. She found it in the particular hard-earned peace of someone who no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space in a room. As for Julian, he found something smaller and harder to name. Not forgiveness. Not a second chance with the only woman who'd ever known him before the money changed his face. Just the quiet, uncomfortable work of becoming a man who might eventually deserve to be trusted again, not by Elena necessarily, but by anyone at all. It would take longer than one night to find out if he could manage it. But for the first time in 2 years, sitting in a folding chair in the back of a room he no longer controlled, listening to the woman he'd once told wasn't enough build something he never could have built alone, Julian Cross finally understood what it felt like to want to.